Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good
So
evening.
we are ready. It's 6 p.m. It's 6 p.m. So I guess we should start. Okay. My name is Marina Julian Joseph, the Education Officer acting for District 1. Okay. So Miss Edith Emmanuel, the facilitators, the consultants, principals, teachers, community members, everyone, good evening. Okay. At this point, I want to take the opportunity to welcome everyone to the Revised Education Act of St. Lucia. I want to encourage you to pay close attention to the changes that are being made, as these will impact our future practices. Feel free to contribute to the discussions in whatever way you can, whether it be in patois or English. Feel free to contribute and participate. It is your time to be part of the Revised Education Act. So let us make the best of it. Again, I want to welcome you and let us participate in our discussion. At this point, I'm going to pray, opening prayer, as without God, we cannot do anything. I hope you are hearing me, everyone.
Amen.
Yes.
So let us pray.
Yes.
Yeah. Heavenly Father, I would like to thank you for today. Thank you for health. Thank you for strength. Thank you for courage. Father, Lord, as we engage in a discussion that will be beneficial to all of us, I want to invite you into the midst of this discussion. Take control of the facilitators, Lord. Help them to be able to deliver to us with ease, that everyone will understand and contribute to the discussion. Open the minds of the rest of us that are participating, that we will understand and we will collaborate with each other and present a very productive activity. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. At this point, I will hand over to Miss Paula McKinnon for her to start the discussion, the consultation. Thank you very much. Do have a good, very pleasant and interactive discussion. If anybody is not able to, if you want to speak patois, I will try to translate to the best of my ability. Thank you very much. Over to you, Miss.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Joseph, and thank you for opening us for us this evening and providing us with the inspiration to have a fruitful discussion about the proposed draft Education Act and regulations. My name is Paula Cook McKinnon, and I am the principal of Mind Bloom Consulting, who, in partnership with St. Francis Xavier University, have supported the development. I would like to say co-created it with many, many, many persons in St. Lucia, the draft that you will be seeing this evening. And I would like to turn it over to Dr. Williams, a member of our team, who will lead tonight's discussion. Dr. Williams?
Thank you very much, Paula, and thank you for the devotion and warm welcome, Mrs. Joseph. Very much appreciate it. And I would like to begin by echoing what Mrs. Joseph said. We hope to have a very good discussion. We welcome your questions and comments this evening. And as we go along, we can pause at any time to address them. So we really hope to hear from you because, as Mrs. Joseph pointed out, the Education Act, any changes to the Act will affect the schooling of children in St. Lucia and the work of educators for a considerable time going forward. So it's a very important topic that we're addressing tonight. Next slide, please, Paula. We'd like to begin. We had our devotion and welcome. We do appreciate your input. We're going to speak about what's going to happen based on the discussion this evening and in the other town halls. And I'd like to point out that there are going to be town halls held around St. Lucia in each district to try to give everyone as much access to the discussions on the Revised Education Act and the maximum opportunity to contribute. So this is the first one. This is our first town hall meeting, and we really do appreciate you taking the time to meet with us this evening and share your thoughts. Next slide, please, Paula. So as Paula just said, we work in partnership with the Ministry of Education, with educators and stakeholders across St. Lucia in that partnership to support the work of updating the Education Act. And the three members of our team who will be facilitating these town hall meetings are Mrs. Fortuna Anthony, Mrs. Paula Cook-McKinnon, who just spoke a moment ago, and myself, Dr. Monica Williams. Paula has had an opportunity to say hi, so I'm going to ask Fortuna if you would like to say a word of greeting this evening.
Thank you very much, Monica. And like you, I want to thank Mrs. Joseph for opening us in prayer and opening the session promptly, and also for giving the assurance to persons present that we welcome speaking in Creole or English if they so desire. So thank you ever so much. And we will have active participation by our 65 persons present so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Anthony. I'd like to just pause for a moment before we go into the discussion of the Draft Education Act and regulations. And for those of you who may not have participated in an online forum before on Zoom, just like to walk through how you can raise your hand. You can contribute in different ways, either by putting a comment in the chat box, and I'm going to ask both Mrs. Anthony and Mrs. McKinnon to watch the chat box for me and flag any questions or comments you have there. You can also raise your hand at any time and ask a question or share a comment with us. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, at the icons, you'll see one entitled Reactions. And when you click on that, the first thing that comes up is a bar to raise your hand. So you simply click on that bar and you'll see that the symbol comes up that you want to share a question or a comment. When you've finished, you simply click again on the bottom of your screen on the lower hand icon. And it's as easy as that. So hopefully we'll see lots of those hands up as we go along this evening and have a good discussion. Next slide, please, Paula. So this is a brief overview of our schedule for this evening. We've had our welcome, devotion, and introductions. We're going to go over the purpose and the ground rules for the meeting shortly. I'm going to share with you a brief description of the review of the St. Lucia Education Act that's been taking place since February in 2022. So we're going to have a description of what's been completed, what's happened so far, and the progress that's been made. Then we're going to go over the core features of the Draft Education Act and regulations. So based on the work that's been done since February 2022, 2 drafts have been prepared. This is the most recent draft. And we're going to go over the core features and go step by step through each part of the Draft Education Act and each section of the draft regulations. And we're going to have pauses as we go along for you to ask questions, make comments, but you can again raise your hand at any time. We want to hear from you your priorities and hopes for the Draft Education Act and regulations. What do you think needs to be addressed? What are the most important priorities that need to be addressed as the regulations and the Education Act are updated? What do you hope to see come out of this Revised Education Act and regulations? So we're going to have that discussion as well. At 7:25, we'll have concluding remarks and a thank you. And at 7:30, we'll adjourn. And we're very respectful of everybody's busy schedules and time. So we will try to keep to this schedule as best we can and make sure that we've started promptly, and we'll make every effort to complete all the different parts of the discussion and to conclude promptly as well. Next slide, please, Paula. So what is the purpose of these town hall meetings? Well, first of all, we want to describe the review and enhancement of the Education Act and walk you through the work that's been done and give you an update on that. Secondly, we want to discuss the core features of the Draft Act and regulations. And in particular, when we're talking about core features, we're going to emphasize what's new in this Draft Education Act versus the current Act of 2005. So we're going to highlight the new additions. As I mentioned a moment ago, we want to listen to your priorities and hopes for the Education Act and regulations. We are recording the session tonight because we want to record your questions and comments, and then we're going to examine them and look for the topics and issues that are raised in the town hall meetings, and we will address those topics and issues in the validation and finalization of the Draft Education Act and regulations. So by participating tonight, you're having an opportunity to contribute to the validation and finalization of a Draft Education Act and regulations. And that's a very important role. Next slide, please. So these are the meeting ground rules. Your questions and comments are welcomed. We've got a minimum of slides and maximum time for discussion. The facilitators are chairing the meeting. This evening, I'll be taking the lead, but Mrs. Anthony and Mrs. McKinnon will be assisting. The meeting, as I mentioned, will start and end promptly, and you can put your comments in the chat box or ask questions in the chat box, and we'll be monitoring that. To speak during the meeting, please use the raise your hand function that I showed you on the screen a few moments ago. And when you're acknowledged by a facilitator, state your name and share your question or comment. We're asking that you keep your question or comment to 3 minutes or less so that as many people as possible can have the chance to speak during the meeting. So if everyone could be concise, we'd really appreciate that to give everybody who wants a turn to speak. We appreciate and respect all questions and comments and ask that you do the same. If there's one thing that we've learned in working with St. Lucians on their Education Act, they are very passionate about it. There are very different opinions about it and what should be in and what should be out. And because this is a very significant topic, we really need to all take our time, listen carefully, and appreciate what other people have to say. We may not agree with it, but it's important that all voices are heard. And that's one of our main goals in these town hall meetings. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to pause there and just check if there are any questions about how the meeting is going to run or any of the ground rules. Does anyone have a question? And I'll take a look at the screen. And also, again, I'm relying on Mrs. Anthony and Mrs. McKinnon. Don't see anything there. Okay, so a brief description of the review. Starting in February 2022, the St. Lucia Department of Education contracted with Mindbloom Consulting and St. Francis Xavier University to partner with St. Lucia educators in the review and the enhancement of the Education Act. So the Department of Education reached out and expressed the desire to review the current Education Act. And the review was undertaken for several reasons. Very importantly, the current Education Act is from 2005, and the Department of Education wants to ensure that the Education Act meets the needs of a modern education system now and in the future. So there was a desire to ensure that the Education Act is current, that it meets the needs of our students today, and that it addresses emerging issues in education that are happening across the Caribbean and around the world. So to make it a state-of-the-art contemporary Education Act. Next slide, please, Paula. So from February up to the present time, we've completed, in partnership with St. Lucians across the island, extensive stakeholder consultations and extensive research has been completed. So we have had consultations with students, parents, educators, various groups, for example, the St. Lucia Teachers Union, the National Principals Association, the Teaching Service Commission, just to name a few. And through all of that, we've been conducting research. So we've been looking at education acts across the Eastern Caribbean, across the Caribbean as a whole, and around the world to identify current issues and how they're being addressed in education systems and what the best practices are that are happening in revisions to education legislation. So we've talked to a lot of people, we've done a lot of research, and we have a mic on there.
Muted.
You're not hearing you, Miss.
Monica, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Based on the findings of the consultations and research that have been conducted since February 2022, a draft Education Act and regulations were prepared in March of this year, in March 2023. So we did a first draft, and then multiple stakeholders provided feedback on this draft. More than 700 suggestions were received, reviewed, and acted upon to create the latest draft that we're looking at and discussing here this evening and in the other town halls. And as I mentioned a moment ago, multiple groups have participated, teachers groups, principals groups. We've had feedback from people at the local college. Many different participants have provided feedback. And we treat that as our key source of knowledge and information going forward. And we're looking for more of that input from all of you this evening. Next slide, please, Paula. So the town hall meetings are being held across the island to provide members of the public with three different aspects here. A description of the review of the Education Act 2005 and the progress achieved to date. Access to the revised November 2023 Draft Education Act and regulations. And they are available on a website with public access, so you can look at them, examine them at any time. They've been posted publicly. And an opportunity to contribute to the validation and finalization of the draft act and regulations. So those are the three purposes of the town hall meetings. Next slide, please. So what's new, or based on all the research, all the consultations, all of the drafting that's gone on so far, what's new in this draft Education Act and regulations? Well, very importantly, right at the start of the Draft Act, there's a new student-centered vision for education in St. Lucia. And that's contained in the what's called the long title. And in this introduction to the Act, so to speak, there's an emphasis on holistic education. So rather than just functioning on student performance on examinations, for example, there's an emphasis on supporting the growth and well-being and development of all students. So their learning, their achievement, their mental and physical wellness, the whole child. So there's that emphasis on holistic education. There's also an emphasis on having the Act address the curriculum and assessment in a contemporary way, so that the proposed national curriculum is inclusive. It upholds the cultural diversity of the peoples in St. Lucia. Oh, we have another mic. And assessment is broadened to provide different types of assessment, not just examinations, but ongoing checks of student progress as they're working, diagnostic assessment, and so on. So All of these things are highlighted in the new student-centered vision for education for St. Lucia. There's also an emphasis on education for all, and that all students have access to education. All children have access. So these are some of the key highlights, starting right off the bat at the beginning of the Act in what's called the long title. Right after that, there's a section of the Act called Interpretations, and this contains the definitions that are used throughout the Education Act. This section has been expanded a lot, and the terminology has been updated. Because one of the things we heard from parents, from educators, from many St. Lucians was that the language that's used in the current Education Act is outdated. In some places in the current Act, there's reference to programs that are no longer provided. In some aspects of the Act, terminology is used that's no longer the accepted terminology in areas such as special needs education. So we also heard from many people that there were definitions that needed to be added to the Act that weren't there currently. So we have expanded the definitions and updated the language significantly. So that's the next piece that is a real change, a real update in the draft. As I mentioned, the focus on holistic education that supports student learning and well-being begins with that vision statement and goes right throughout the Act. So whether we're talking about the curriculum, whether we're talking about teachers' duties and rights, all through every part of the Act, that's highlighted. Other key developments are universal access to education is now in the Draft Act. And what that means is that all students have access to education. That's one of their rights. So we have a section in the Act on the rights of students, and this is one of the rights that they have. Also, the right to free tuition, so that all children can access their education and can attend school with free tuition. There's also protection from discrimination in the Draft Act and regulations, so that children can't be discriminated against or denied an education on grounds such as gender or ability or ethnic background or language. So there's protection from discrimination as well. In addition, another thing that's new in the Draft Act and regulations is there's a new Council on Special Needs Education and Inclusive Education. And I should mention that inclusive education is emphasized throughout the Draft Act and regulations as well. So this new council will provide support for accommodating children with a wide range of special needs in the schools, provide support and guidance, and this is a new development in the Act. Also new is a national code of conduct. So at present, there are different school rules and school codes of conduct in the schools across St. Lucia, and many different stakeholders identified a need to have some kind of common standards for student behavior that everyone could follow. And so the National Code of Conduct gives those common standards of behavior and also a standard for appropriate dress in St. Lucia schools. So that's new as well. And that is referenced in the Education Act and described in detail in the regulations. We also have the compulsory school age expanded. Instead of 5 to 15 years, it's now increased to cover 3 to 17 years. So now early childhood education has been added to the Draft Act for children ages 3 to 5 years. And that also accommodates pre-kindergarten programs, which are already in operation in some schools across the island, but weren't referenced in the current Education Act. We heard from many educators, principals, teachers, vice principals, ministry leaders, that there was a need for clear authority for teachers and for school administrators to be able to discipline students and protect the safety and security of students and staff at school. And we have strengthened their authority to do just that. So that's another addition to the Act. It's clearly spelled out. We had feedback that it wasn't clear at the present time, so we tried to clarify that. We've added many different types of education to the Act. especially with the pandemic. We have online education, blended education, distance education, and these were not in the 2005 Act. And so we've added all these new types of education to the Act. And throughout the whole Act, we have clearly defined rights, duties, powers, and responsibilities. Everyone from the minister and the permanent secretary and the chief education officer to students and parents and teachers and school counselors and so forth. That was another request we had from many people that we've addressed. The rights, duties, powers, and responsibilities are now clearly spelled out. Next slide, please, Paula.
Monica, there is a question that's come through the feed that are there provisions for promotion and administering of adult literacy?
There is a provision for adult education now in the Act. That's now included in the interpretation section. And further on in the Act, it's stated that the minister may provide adult education. So I think adult literacy programs would fall under that. That is now in the Act. Great question. So those are the highlights, and I'm not going to read all this to you. I'm just going to show you the parts of the Act and the regulations and go into discussion. 2 more slides, and then we're opening it up to the floor. So what are the parts of the Draft Education Act? There's a preliminary section that has the long title. I see a question here. What are the disciplinary actions that are in place for the students? Great question. In the National Code of Conduct, we've spelled out different types of student misbehavior and different responses to student misbehavior. So we've provided specific responses. It could be in-school suspension. It could be a reprimand. It could be a verbal warning. It could be an out-of-school suspension. There's a comprehensive list of responses to student misbehavior, and that's spelled out in the National Code of Conduct and the regulations. Great questions. Okay.
And Monica, there's one more question. Does alternative education cover homeschooling?
Great question. Homeschooling is treated separately. Now, that's another topic we had a lot of requests about. People wanted to have more guidance on homeschooling, more structure. We have really strengthened that part of the Act. So there's more detail provided on homeschooling, and also to have inspections and monitoring of homeschooling. That's now been added to the Act.
And another question, if homeschooling is expanded in the Act, does that necessitate a homeschooling curriculum and guidelines?
Excellent question. What we've done in the section on homeschooling is stated that the National Curriculum of St. Lucia will serve as the standard for homeschooling programs. So they will work toward the main content and objectives of the national curriculum. But we recognize as well that parents may want to add other pieces of instruction to homeschooling programs, and that's perfectly acceptable as well. But throughout the Act, we're using the national curriculum as the standard for instruction across the island.
And one more for you. Does the disciplinary action, is it for kindergarten and grade? It says, does the disciplinary action, is it for kindergarten and grade 1 up to grade 3 or the higher grades? I guess what is the scope of the disciplinary action?
That's an excellent question. Fortuna, did you want to speak to that? I just saw your mic. Oh, okay. The scope of the National Code of Conduct is for children of all ages in education, so ages 3 to 17 years, and for students who stay in secondary school for some extra time can go right up to 20. So it can go from 3 to 20 years. That's an excellent question because with regard to the young children, with regard to children who have different needs, it's emphasized in the Code of Conduct that when educators are responding to misbehavior, they have to take into account, oh, someone's not hearing anything. They have to take into account, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. They have to take into account the age, the developmental level, any special needs that the child has. So all those factors had to be taken into account when responding to student behavior. So that's an excellent point that was raised in that question.
And one more.
Great.
On the new Council on Special Needs Education, what provision is made for children who are operating at a high academic level?
Well, interestingly, what we're proposing is on the new Council for Special Education and Inclusive Education, that one of the members of that council be a secondary student with special needs. So we want to get student voice in there. And we also recognize in the list of special needs, which has been updated, that it's very broad and it also includes giftedness. So that students who are gifted may certainly encounter some challenges and require some supports in school. So we've added that explicitly in the Act. The other thing I would say is for high-functioning children with special needs, a key advance in the Draft Act is that we're recommending that children be educated in the least restrictive environment with their age peers, unless it's absolutely necessary that they attend a separate school. So we're promoting that children with special needs are, wherever possible, educated with their age peers, unless they require a very specialized kind of education that's delivered in a special education school. So for children with special needs who are high functioning, there's more opportunity to attend classes in their neighborhood schools. These are really good questions. I know I keep saying excellent, but they are excellent questions. Anything else there, Paula?
No, not right now.
Okay.
Does this extend to streaming? It just came in.
Well, that's another issue we heard quite a bit about. One of the ways that we're tackling streaming in the Draft Education Act is around the whole issue of assessment. And so as opposed to assessment being focused on examinations and students being ranked and placed in different programs solely on the basis of examinations, we're recommending a much broader type of assessment be used, where there are ongoing checks on student performance, where students have different ways to show what they've learned in addition to examinations, in the hope that that will open up the discussion and the information that's taken into account when students are being recommended for different programs. So, we have certainly heard a lot about streaming, and we're really recommending major changes to student assessment to address that.
And Monica, this is just a comment, not a question. Usually people think of special needs children as children who are underperforming. We need to get this out of people's heads.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are many negative stereotypes. And for example, you can have a child, and I'm speaking from decades of experience in special education as well as other aspects of education. You can have a child who's in a wheelchair, who's gifted, who is a gifted student. And just because she's in a wheelchair, it doesn't mean she's not academically strong. So we have to get past those stereotypes and look at the whole child, again, back to holistic education and how we can best meet their needs. Okay, so these are the... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's it for the chat right now.
Great. Thank you, Paula. So these are the parts of the Act. I've spoken about the highlights. So I'm just going to show you what the parts of the Act are. The preliminary section, which includes those definitions that I mentioned and the purpose of the Act. The administration of the education system is part 1. And that talks about the duties and responsibilities of the minister, the permanent secretary, the senior leaders in the ministry, and education advisory boards. In part 2, we have the stages of education and types of schools, including denominational schools, public schools, private schools. As I mentioned a few moments ago, we have an expanded section on homeschooling and also special needs education and inclusive education. And I see a question. I'm not sure if it was discussed, but does the revised Act make provision for the gifted child? Yes, it does. Giftedness is now recognized explicitly in the Act. Please keep the questions coming. Rights and responsibilities of students and parents is part 3. So there are statements in there about, as I mentioned, universal access to education, also student accountability to the educators who are teaching them, and the rights and duties of parents. Another one, have provisions been made for a standardized curriculum for early childhood education? That is not something that I'm aware of. I know there's a lot of discussion about the national curriculum. I don't know, Paula or Fortuna, if you wanted to comment further on that.
I do not think that we have begun looking at a specific curriculum for early childhood, but this is a very good point that has been raised.
Yes, I think that the curriculum mostly is focused on kindergarten through secondary.
That's
Okay,
right.
thank you. And was there another comment there in the chat? Is there proper training for teachers on the subject of special needs, and what should they expect from those children, such as certain behaviors or traits and how to handle them correctly and with empathy? We don't reference training for special needs explicitly in the Act. I know that there's ongoing work in the country at the present time on a new policy for special education. And I believe that that is being addressed in that policy work. So it is a topic that's under discussion, but it hasn't been addressed directly in the Act. Can you please elaborate on special needs education and inclusive education? Certainly. So special needs education are programs and services that are tailored to meet the needs of children with various special needs. They could have autism spectrum disorder, learning disabilities. They could have giftedness and they need enrichment. The child might have some motor difficulties and be in a wheelchair and require an accessible classroom and bathroom. So special education is really tailored to meet the needs of those children. It can take the form of individual education plans or IEPs or accommodations in school for the children. Inclusive education is a bit broader. So inclusive education is really supporting the inclusion of all children in school. And it's not just students with special needs, that's a part of it, but it goes beyond that to say we have to have education that welcomes children from different backgrounds, different cultures, who have different languages, who come from different family structures. So inclusive education is welcoming all children and meeting them where they are, regardless of their differences. So it's broader than special education, but again, it is the accommodation of difference that is at the core of inclusive education. Okay, we need more teachers for special needs in public schools. Can you define homeschooling? So with regard to the special needs, Paul, is it okay if I mention the assessment?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so in another major project that's been ongoing in the area, including St. Lucia, an assessment, the first assessment, like full assessment of special education in St. Lucia and in the OECS countries was completed over the past year and a half, and the report was finalized in June. That report has been publicly released. It included a survey that was responded to by over 5,500 teachers, students, parents, members of the public. We had community members and a massive amount of research and consultation. In that report on the assessment of special education in the OECS, it is clearly identified that there is a need for more trained special education teachers. It's also identified there is a major need for specialists who can diagnose and treat different special needs. So if you're interested in the work that's going on in the area of special education, I would strongly recommend that you access that report, because it does address these issues in detail, and they are very important issues.
And may I ask, add in here, Monica, that this report, I'm sure, is on the ministry website. So it can be accessed.
It has been
I don't believe it is on the ministry website, because it is an OECS report. So, but I think if persons wanted to follow up with that, they could certainly contact persons in the ministry who could then access it through their representatives in the OECS.
Okay, I thought I saw it there, but I could be wrong. Thanks.
Thank you. So just
I'm sorry, Fortuna, if that is the case, that's wonderful. But that I hadn't seen it, so I didn't want to guarantee that it was there.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay. Part
Someone
4
is still not hearing us. I do not know why.
Sophia, please go ahead. I see your hand up.
Hi, good evening. I'm just following up on the inquiry about the report. This is something that we can make available to persons who are interested and circulate it to the schools. I am on the OECS pool as the national coordinator and do have access to the report.
Thank you very much. That's great.
Nice to have you here.
Yes, that's wonderful. So part 4 is about student admission to schools, their student attendance and school records. And part 5 is the national curriculum, instruction, and assessment of students. And I've highlighted the major changes before, but these are the parts of the Act. I would like to point out that in the section Part 4 on admission, attendance, and records, we have put in stronger provisions to support student attendance at school. And we have updated the rights and duties of the school attendance officer, because we recognize that student attendance has been an ongoing issue in education systems around the world since the pandemic, and St. Lucia is no different. And we heard from many people that they wanted more supports for student attendance, and we've put them in there. Okay, next slide, please.
Another comment. Students enter secondary school based on their results of the CPEA. Is there any other information given about each student that would, I just lost the comment, that would be beneficial to the school that the student has moved to?
That's another point that has been raised in our consultations and has been addressed in the draft act. So what's recommended now in Part 4 on student admission, attendance, and records is that there would be a school record for every student in school that would include their grades, their attendance, their progress reports, so that there would be information for secondary schools to receive on the student in addition to the examination results. So we are recommending that records be kept on each child to provide that information going forward.
And another question, what provision is made for the implementation of 21st century teaching and learning skills in the schools?
That is highly emphasized in the national curriculum. And so in Part 5, when you look at the description of the national curriculum, to give you just a couple of examples, in this section, it talks about the importance of students not just learning things, but learning how to think critically, how to apply what they're learning in school, out in the community or in the workplace, communication skills. All of these different 21st century skills are emphasized. And again, it's not just students learning something and then repeating it on an exam. really that they gain knowledge and skills and values and competencies that they can use in school and life. So it's that very broad 21st century approach to curriculum that's emphasized in that part of the Act.
And another comment, while I advocate the need for more special education teachers, I think the time has come for all of our teachers to be exposed to aspects of special education. Teachers' attitude towards children with special needs is the greatest hindrance. It may be as a result of lack of knowledge.
I think that the issue around children with special needs and having more capacity in the schools is one that certainly merits attention and has been meriting attention, as I just explained. We've just completed a major assessment and identified these areas. With regard to teacher training, I agree with you, and I think everybody on our team would agree with you, I'm sure they would, that accommodating children with special needs is something that every teacher needs to learn how to do. And teachers require support to do that. So it's a very valid point, and it's something that's receiving increased attention.
And then another question, what is the need for the minimum standard exams?
So they are included in the interpretation section of the Act and the definitions. The different national examinations or regional examinations are defined. And then they do serve a purpose in terms of what is the need for them. They are a type of summative assessment that gives information about how much students have learned at the end of a term or a school year. So they do provide that information. But it's important, as we've been saying, that's not the only information about how students are performing. There are many different kinds of assessment. And rather than viewing them as the assessment, they are one type.
And we do have a comment in the chat about, excuse me, I am deaf and I am not hearing what you are saying. So we will work to determine how we might make it possible for you to hear. We will attempt to deal with that, and we sincerely apologize that you're not being able to hear this as well as we would want you to. So we will work on that.
Thank you, Paula.
Yeah.
Yes,
ahead,
absolutely. Next slide, please. So these are the other parts of the Act. Part 6 is the management of schools. And in this section, we talk about boards of management. We also have expanded, there's a real desire in the country to expand parent-teacher associations to parent-teacher community associations so that there's a broader partnership between the schools and the communities, and that's been included in the Draft Act. Part 7, the National Code of Conduct, School Rules and Discipline. We have, again, strengthened the descriptions and clarified the authority of educators to discipline students. And we're really striking a balance between giving principals and vice principals and teachers the authority to protect the safety and security of students and staff while still respecting the rights of students. So that is another part of the Draft Act. Someone would like to turn on captions, Paula.
Okay.
Okay.
Great suggestion.
That's a very good suggestion. Okay. The rights and duties of educators. So that includes principals, vice principals, teachers, and we've added school guidance counselors to this section of the Act. They weren't in there before. Part 9 is the St. Lucia Island Scholarship, which has been updated. Part 10 describes the appeal processes that parents and others in the system can access if an educational decision has been made that they don't agree with and they would like to have reviewed. And then Part 11 is miscellaneous topics like loitering on school premises, contagious diseases, closure of schools. And I see some other things coming up in the chat box. Can you read them out, Paula, please? They're
Yes,
disappearing before I can read them.
I know, no problem. Just let me go back up to where they started. Okay, here we go. Bear with me. Oh, has provision been made to standardize in what form students in the secondary school choose their subjects? For instance, some school choose subjects in Form 2 rather than Form 3.
There's provision in the national curriculum, including in the regulations, the description of the national curriculum and the regulations, to accommodate a lot of different subjects in secondary schools, as well as alternative education. So it's not standardizing, but it's giving the secondary schools the leeway to choose from a variety of subjects that meet their students' needs for secondary education. Next slide, please, Paula. So that's the Act. I just want to pause there. We've been getting lots of questions and comments and open it up to the floor. Other questions or comments about the Draft Education Act? And again, you can find this online. It's publicly available knowledge or information that you can access to learn more. Any other questions or comments about the Draft Act? I'm just checking to see if there are any raised hands, but I don't see any.
Let's see. There's one new message here.
When can I access the Act?
Right.
It's already.
So it is available on the ministry's website?
Website, yes.
Any last call? Any other questions or comments on the Act, Draft Act? And we'll just quickly go into the regulations. What measures are in place to avoid?
Sorry, is it okay to speak?
Yes. Oh, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I was asking the question, what measures are in place to avoid teachers? We've had situations where teachers leave in the middle of a term, and sometimes the students struggle during that period of during that transition time. Are there measures in place to avoid or to mitigate teachers leaving in the middle of a term, whether primary or secondary school? And what are in place? Because we know sometimes school actually have to look for a teacher, or sometimes there's a lull between the teacher leaving and a new teacher coming in. So it's a serious situation that has affected students in some schools. I just wanted to hear on that.
That is a serious issue. I would say that it's not addressed directly in the Education Act because that touches upon the teacher's contract as to how and when they can resign from a position. So it's not something that would usually be addressed in an Education Act, but could certainly be addressed in the contract. That may also be a topic that the Teaching Service Commission, is best positioned to address because they are involved in the appointment of teachers. So I wish I had an answer for you that said it is addressed in the Act, but right now it is not. And thank you for flagging it. Anyone else like to raise a question or offer a comment?
There's a question. There's a question here with regard to Part 8 of the Education Act. Is there anything within the Act that speaks to teacher in charge where primary schools have no vice principal?
It doesn't explicitly speak to teacher in charge, and that's a really good point that we should note, because that does happen. So that's something that we should really look at. Thank you for raising it.
And is there any provision made for substitute teachers when teachers are absent?
Well, the rights and duties of educators. So the rights and duties of teachers, vice principals, principals, school counselors. When a substitute teacher is employed in the school instructing the children, he or she has the same duties as if it was a full-time teacher, the same rights. And so that the Act applies to substitute teachers as well as teachers who are full-time employed in the position.
And then there's a question here about retirement age. I believe the Act should say at the end of the school year when the teacher turns 60, not on their 60th birthday. And I think that relates to, a teacher retiring in the middle of a year.
Right. And that, again, may be something that would be looked at in the teacher's contract around retirement provisions, but it's not something that's usually addressed in an Education Act. Is the compulsory school age still 15 years? It is expanded to 3 to 17 years now in the Draft Act, Sophia.
And there's a hand up, Janine Emmanuel.
Janine, go ahead. Janine Emmanuel, go ahead.
Good evening. I've been listening to the program from the beginning, and the Act. What I'm trying to find out is there anything in place for bullying, especially with our children of special needs? I've witnessed certain things that have been happening in schools with the older kids, most of the older ones that are bullying the younger ones that are differently abled. And is there something in the Act that is going to help teachers to try to combat this kind of actions?
Thank you very much for that question. Yes, there is in the Act and the regulations. In the National Code of Conduct, bullying is recognized as, it's defined, it's recognized as student misbehavior that has to be addressed. Also, we've tackled cyberbullying, bullying children online, inappropriate use of the internet, which also is used sometimes in bullying. We've addressed all those issues in the National Code of Conduct, and they're spelled out because that the whole area of bullying, unfortunately, has become so rampant, and it needs to be addressed. So it is.
There's a question here. Often teachers take students on field trips in relation to concepts that are being taught. Is there anything in the Act that stipulates how children should be cared for on these occasions?
So that would be student trips, and it's not addressed explicitly under student trips, but certainly part of the duties of a teacher, principal, vice principal, a teacher who's supervising on a school trip would apply, that they are supervising the students, that they are monitoring discipline, etc. So whether they're in the school or on a school trip, those duties of the teachers would apply. However, in other places, often school trips are dealt with in a separate policy. So there often is a policy on school trips that talks about what kinds of transportation are acceptable, how many chaperones you need, the types of activities that you can go on school trips for. So that would be more of a policy topic.
May I add in here, Monica, that there is also school policies that dictate that depending on how many children are being taken out on educational tours, that there must be a stipulated number of adults. To issues of the type of transportation, is also part of the criteria that principals normally use in the selection of coaches or transportation for children. So I think, and children are insured by the government of St. Lucia. So there are a number of things in place to safeguard children being taken out on educational tours.
Thank you very much, Fortuna, and that's great to hear. It is a very important policy issue for the safety and security of the students and also the staff on the trips. So thank you for sharing that.
And another question, if at 15 a child no longer shows interest in school and plays truancy, is the parent or guardian now obligated to allow that student to continue schooling until age 17?
That's a really good question. With the expanded school age, we would expect that they would attend until age 17, unless, for example, in some instances, they may complete secondary school at a younger age. So it's up to age 17 or when they complete secondary school.
If I may add in here also that there is normally communication between the principal, the school counselors play a very critical part here, and decisions are made. This is why sometimes children are asked whether they would like to move on to the Center for Adolescent Development, depending on what they see their future skills being involved in. So there is communication. But when it comes to obligation, according to the law, children should be at school. And since we are expanding it, 17, but we are hoping that there will be that kind of open communication with the child, the parents, the school counselor, and the principal to seek alternative education. This is why the government is presently moving in the way of TVET schools, where skills of interest could be chosen by the child. Yes, I noticed somebody is speaking about NELU. Yes, sometimes children are referred to go into NELU where they learn a skill, you know? So there are different pathways that are now being put in place.
Thank you, Fortuna. And around that issue, we have added alternative education to the Act in the definitions and also in the types of education that the minister may authorize for that very reason. So that students who perhaps need a non-traditional type of education, more vocationally oriented, that there would be opportunities for that. So that has been added to the Act.
And another question, the substitute teacher, is there anything that states about having substitute teachers at the school in the absence of another teacher due to sick leave, instead of a teacher being subjected to teaching or supervising 2 classes?
There's nothing in the Act about that specific issue. Again, the teacher assignments, this is really speaking to teacher assignments, is usually handled through the contract, the teacher's contract, as opposed to in the Education Act. So for that reason, it's not in there.
Also are the Also, are the roles and responsibility of the school counselors included in the draft act, also increasing the number of school counselors for each district?
The rights and duties of school counselors have been added to the draft act. They've been added to the section on the rights and duties of educators. So they're included now along with principals, vice principals, and teachers. You'll also find the school counselor's role defined.
And then there's a question, is the draft act on the government.lc website? If so, I'm not able to locate it. I would suggest that you go to the Ministry of Education Facebook page. That's probably the easiest place to access it. And There are instances where the teacher is the bully, and actually the Equip Facebook page as well. There are instances where the teacher is the bully. What can be put in place in this situation?
Well, one of the things about the National Code of Conduct is that it sets a standard for behavior for all members of a school community. And teachers have roles and responsibilities to demonstrate positive, respectful behavior, just as students do, administrators, parents coming into the schools. So there's an expectation that everyone will follow the standard of behavior. And it's not just aimed at students, it's aimed at the members of a school community.
And we have one more. Just a comment. I don't think substitute teacher policies should be left to contracts. This will just encourage the practice of teachers holding two classes. If it is legislated, then the ministry has to find a substitute teacher. I think, go ahead, Monica, respond.
No, go ahead, Paula.
Well, I do think that this is within the purview of the Teaching Service Commission, because that is the Teaching Service Commission appoints teachers. And so I think it is beyond, perhaps, we can check with our drafting team that supports this, but I think it's beyond, it would be within the Teaching Service Commission purview, not within the Education Act, within the purview of the Education Act.
I agree. Okay, next slide, please, Paula. We'll go to the regulations.
Oops, there we go.
So we have a one-slide summary on the key points in the draft regulations. And I want to point out that if these regulations are adopted, or a version of them, it will be the first time that St. Lucia has regulations to support the Education Act. Regulations really are a set of procedures that help to guide everyone to implement the Act. They help with the interpretation of the Act and the implementation of it. So the regulations are a great support. And if regulations were enacted along with the Education Act, it would be a big step ahead. So in terms of the sections, there's a preliminary section, like an introduction to the regulations. Part 1 deals with administration of schools. Now, in this section, there are guidelines spelled out for the length of the school year, the length of the school day, the school calendar that has to be published every year by the ministry, how long the school vacations are, what should be included in school timetables. So all of those procedures are spelled out in the regulations. And there's an emphasis in those provisions to protect teaching time. One of the things we've heard from many people is that there are a lot of disruptions to teaching time, and teachers don't feel they have enough time to cover the curriculum. So we really tried in this section to respond to those concerns and set some parameters around protection of teaching time. The national curriculum is described in Part 2 and Schedule 5 in the regulations. The primary and secondary curriculum is described, and as mentioned earlier, it upholds the cultures and peoples and histories of St. Lucia and the languages. It's got a focus on 21st century skills and values and learning. So it's a very broad curriculum framework. Management of public schools is addressed in Part 3. And again, there's more detail provided on how private schools, assisted schools, homeschooling, all these different parts of the education system operate. Also, there's a list of the matters that are to be looked at during school visits and inspections, and also inspections of homeschooling. Part 4 are the councils and associations, and as I mentioned earlier on, we've moved beyond parent-teacher associations to parent-teacher community associations, a national council of them, so an increased emphasis on partnership. And in Part 5 and in Schedule 8 in the regulations, there is a detailed description of the National Code of Conduct, including the purpose, the guiding principles, the standards of behavior, the standard for appropriate dress for members of a school community, different categories of misbehavior. And a moment ago, I mentioned bullying is singled out as one of those misbehaviors that's addressed. There's a description of acceptable and unacceptable responses to misbehavior and roles and responsibilities of students, parents, teachers, the Ministry of Education, principals to support positive behavior and safe and secure schools. So that's all listed in detail in the National Code of Conduct and the regulations. Part 6 deals with disciplinary complaints and hearings. Part 7 describes how an education appeals tribunal operates. And Part 8 is miscellaneous. It includes different schedules and forms that are used to apply to the ministry to operate a school, for admission to school, etc. So those are the pieces that are included in the draft regulations.
Monica, we have a question. Sorry if this was said earlier, but does the Act deal with the age of entry into the primary school system versus child readiness? For example, will gifted 3 or 4-year-olds be able to begin primary education early?
So this was a topic of a lot of discussion, the ages for entry into school. And the way it's worded in the Act now, it's a bit more flexible than it was. So certainly exceptional circumstances like giftedness can be taken into account in the draft Act when looking at the age of entry to different schools. I'd have to check if that's explicitly for primary school, but I know for secondary school, it can be considered. The other thing I want to point out, though, is with the expansion of the compulsory school age to 3 to 17 years, there's now provision for 3 to 5-year-olds for early childhood education, and also, as I mentioned a while ago, for pre-kindergarten programs. So there is more flexibility. I'd have to check on the specific wording for entry into primary school.
And another comment, I am happy the school age has been expanded to 17 because too many of our boys and girls are out in the street. It should be law that they attend technical school if they don't want to attend regular school till 17. So the fact that they are in school is a good thing. And if they don't want to be in one program, they should have the option of the other, I believe is what this person is saying. And Sophia has her hand up. So Sophia?
If I could just comment on that further, please, Paula.
Sure.
We've also added to the Act, there are some students who would stay beyond the age of 17 in school to access different programs. They may take longer to complete secondary school, or students with special needs who stay longer. So there is now a provision in the Draft Act for what we call extended school age for youth aged 18 to 20 years, so that some of those students may stay longer as necessary. We've also added that in. Sophia, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I wanted to speak to addressing pre-K. I didn't get it quite clearly what your response was, but it seemed that the Act may not have spoken to pre-K education. I'm not sure if this is what I heard, but if this is the case, then I see it as a gap, because if we are saying the Act addresses children 3 to 17 years, then pre-K definitely falls within the purview of the Act. But also, we are aware that we have a number of primary schools which have now begun, or I guess incorporated pre-K into their structure. And this is formally done through the Ministry of Education. We currently have 6 schools that started this program. Well, it's not a program, but a revision of the structure of the school and having pre-K there effective September 2023. We are getting ready for an additional 3 schools. They are actually doing the refurbishment and the preparation to add pre-K to that structure. And this is something that we believe we will be moving ahead in terms of that format. So we will see quite a number of our primary schools officially starting from pre-kindergarten as opposed to kindergarten. In terms of the curriculum, there is, I think it's an adapted high scope curriculum that is being used, and the teachers are trained. And so therefore, the Act should address pre-K students in that regard. Also, I think one of the challenges we had now is with the Act looking at children from age 5 entering K, the insurance issue would need to be addressed. So if the Act places focus on pre-K students as well, then that's one issue that would be mitigated in terms of how do we get the coverage for the children in that group. And in terms of the code of conduct and looking at discipline, I notice we have a hearing and disciplinary complaints, etc., and acceptable and unacceptable responses to misbehavior. And I'm assuming that this speaks to positive discipline, which is supported by the Ministry of Education, following on the abolishment of corporal punishment in schools. So whilst we do have positive discipline, it should be aligned to whatever the National Code of Conduct is. And I'm not sure if it speaks to teachers being properly trained in administering positive discipline. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. So with regard to pre-kindergarten, I'm just looking at the draft act now. It certainly accommodates a primary school offering early childhood education. We did in a former draft of this expressly reference pre-kindergarten. It got taken out in the most recent drafting, but I really feel it needs to be explicitly stated again, because we had added pre-kindergarten to the definitions and to the stages of schooling. So we will add that back in. This is an important point.
That is, especially since it's in the formal structure now.
Yes. So we will add that back in. It will accommodate it now, but we'll add it back in. Back to the question of entry into school, and someone said about giftedness, just to read from part of the Act now. For example, normally a child of 11 years or older would be admitted to secondary school, but a younger child might be admitted if they had consistently high performance in annual examinations, as key assessments on the recommendation of teachers. So there is some flexibility to recognize giftedness to consider an entry into secondary school as an example. With regard to your question about positive behavior in the National Code of Conduct, absolutely, it's aligned. The emphasis is on positive behavior interventions and supports in the National Code. Also, restorative justice. We've introduced in-school suspensions to provide an alternative to having students out of school for misbehavior. So we've added a number of supports, and we've talked a lot about educational psychosocial supports, including behavioral supports, and the teaching of behavioral expectations. So all of that is aligned with positive behavior in the practice of the ministry.
Excellent. I'm happy to hear that. Thanks.
You're welcome. Next slide, please, Paula.
Actually, we've got some comments here as well.
Okay.
With the removal of corporal punishment in schools, we have seen an increase in negative student behavior. Is there any consideration in the Education Act to reintroduce such method, even in a limited capacity where perhaps only the principal or such can administer such disciplinary measures?
That's a very thoughtful question. We haven't reintroduced corporal punishment, but what we have added, based on concerns expressed by many people we consulted with, was a provision that if the safety and security of a school is threatened, if a student, for example, brings weapons to school or illegal drugs or is threatening harm to people, the teachers and the principals now have the authority to search a student's backpack or locker or person and to seize illegal drugs or weapons. So they do have that power. There is still a provision in the Act There's in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension. There is still a provision for expulsion for repeated misbehavior of a very serious nature when all other supports have been, exhausted. There still is provision in the Act for expulsion as well. So there are a number of avenues, not attitudes, avenues to address very serious misbehavior that threatens the safety and security of people at school.
And I think that responds to the next point, which was, what about students who pose a continuous threat to school security and safety and underperform but have not reached the age of 17? So there is an avenue there for expulsion.
There is.
Okay, and one more. Love this format where pre-K would be introduced in the primary schools. I think that was for Sophia. What about, this question is, what about management joint board? For example, if a propriety have more than one school, and rather than having an individual board for each school, a joint board is established. It seems that is not in the draft. So if I'm interpreting this correctly, is it possible to have a management board for more than one school?
I would have to check on that. The wording from my work with it is more about one school, but that's another really good point that we can look into. That's a really good point for us to consider when we're looking at final revisions to the draft.
And question, would the application for permit to operate a private school detail the requirements for operating such a school?
That is spelled out in the Education Act, the requirements for operating a private school, and there's more information provided about that in the regulations as well. Same for a denominational school, so we have provided detail.
Please place in the Act provisions for parents to take parenting classes, especially for those parents who refuse to take responsibility for their children's behavior and blame teachers and schools.
Well, in the Act, we do have rights and duties of students and parents do have responsibilities around promoting positive behavior, cooperating with teachers in the provision of their child's education. So there are duties spelled out in the Act for both parents and students, and the emphasis is on collaboration and communication between the home and school, that everybody has a role to play, and so we have highlighted that in the Act.
And I would add to that the proposed new parent-teacher community association would be of tremendous help in that regard.
Yes, absolutely.
Another comment, my comments just moved. In terms of searching bags, I believe, depending on the circumstances, the teacher should seek assistance from the police.
There is a section in the Act that states the obligation to report to police immediately any illegal activity. So that is clearly stated in the Act.
But I think the spirit of the ability to have school administrators give the right for search and seizure is that it may be a circumstance where the police cannot be there quickly enough.
That's right. When there's an imminent threat to the safety and security of students or staff, or a student is threatening to harm themselves, police may not be able to get there quickly enough. And so now the administrators and the teachers have the authority to act.
As it relates to school security, has any consideration been made to increase the number of security guards on duty during the school day?
That is a personnel issue that would be addressed by the ministry. They would look at their hiring practices, but it's not something that would be addressed in an Education Act because numbers like that change over time. So it's not something that would be included in the Act.
And a person still having difficulty finding the Act on the websites or Facebook pages, I think if you go to Equip Facebook, EQUIP, you will find it there. The question, why not employ actual security officers at the school instead of watchmen? Many schools have elderly watchmen who can get seriously hurt in the event of break-ins or school fights. Again, that's a staffing matter, I believe, Monica?
That is a Ministry Human Resources matter. Yes.
Yeah. And does the Education Act address in any manner, form, Parent Teachers Association?
It does, and they've now expanded to become parent-teacher community associations. So we've made provisions for them in the Act and the regulations, and also for a national council of parent-teacher community associations.
And does the Act address issues of reintegration of students?
So just for clarification, is that reintegration after a suspension, an out-of-school suspension? I'm just wondering, reintegration
after expulsion. I think Sophia
speaks to the idea of perhaps children who may have dropped out, because I noticed we spoke about expulsion, but when we talk about reintegration and reducing dropout, we look at perhaps that maybe the standard secondary school might not be appropriate for a child, and that we need to provide alternative educations. Although we spoke about TVET, this is just one pathway. And so if a child has dropped out, sometimes we have children who for whatever socioeconomic reason may have dropped out of school and need to come back in, and sometimes that is difficult. So is there anything that speaks to reintegration of children who may have left the system and need to get back into the system? And it doesn't necessarily mean, I get the feeling that when we speak about the education, we think of just the standard secondary schools, but I believe the Act should probably speak to alternative offerings of education that may not necessarily be going in and doing a standard CXC. So does the Act speak to that at all?
It does. In the definitions, alternative education has been spelled out. And to your point, Sophia, TVET is one form, but there are many different forms. And so in the definitions, it points out that alternative education provides non-traditional routes for students to successfully complete school, including training to enter various occupations. It's wide. And also in the body of the Act, in the different types of education that the minister can authorize, alternative education is listed there. We're also looking at strengthening the statement about alternative education to include it in the national curriculum. So it is something that has been added, and we're looking at emphasizing that even more because it is so important for so many students. It really is a lifeline for them to complete school and then successfully enter the workforce.
So therefore, is there an explicit statement about reintegration?
No, so we would look at that as well.
Yeah, that might be a gap. Somebody might get pregnant, somebody might have dropped out for financial, economic reasons, and a year later they decide they're not 17 yet and want to come back into school. And we've had cases like that, and it's very difficult to get them back in, especially children who perhaps just dropped out for whatever reason it is. Even the principals sometimes don't want to take them back. And so I feel the Act should have some explicit statement about that.
Thank you very much. And for the question raised about that.
If I might comment on that, that is why the Special Education Needs and Inclusive Education Council is so broad, because that is a place where that would fall quite naturally. Because if a person's coming in to be reintegrated for whatever reason, then they might need the special provisions that would come through that newly formed council, or their rights represented through that newly formed council, and things like an IEP or alternate education, those sorts of things would, I think, am I not right, Monica, fall into that?
They could certainly fall under there. They could fall under alternative education. It's also about prohibition against discrimination.
Exactly.
That's another big area here that we're touching on, that a student can't be denied an education because they're pregnant.
Right.
So those are things, this is really helpful conversation for us to be even more explicit in the draft about these issues. That's very important. And Julietta, I see you've had your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yes, I needed to ask, are there clear guidance in the revised act for students who have completed the primary program and have been exempted from writing CPA? Is it left to the discretion of the CEO to have them remain at the primary school until age 17? Or should there be a discussion as to what is the best alternative for the students? Thanks.
That's a really good question. I don't have an answer for that. I'll have to look that up. I don't believe that's explicitly addressed in the Act. We do talk about age of entry. We talk about those examinations, but that particular exemption is not addressed to my knowledge, no. So we'll have to look and see how the Act deals with that question. These are very, very helpful questions and comments.
Can I just say here that I think the ministry is very much aware. Probably when we look at inclusive education, this is why training has been given to a number of persons so that, and the ministry working along with the Center for Adolescent Development, some students are now being schooled at CARE because of their academic performance during the CPA. They are not just left out there. They are not left in the school to turn 17 or anything like that. So I think this has been addressed. We will look very closely to see whether we are specific in the Act about those kids. But always when we are doing the Education Act, we remember the Education for All that St. Lucia has signed into. We also remember the rights of the child, and all that is encompassed within statements within the Education Act. Everything cannot be spelled out in the Education Act, so we have supporting codes and regulations. So I think we are moving in that direction. I was glad that when Sophia mentioned reintegration of students, because this reintegration of a child who has been pregnant has been in operation in St. Lucia for years now. Yes, there are some principals who are not guided accordingly, but I know students have been returned to the schools, and there has been discussions on, do they wish to return to the same school where they were, or would they like to transition to another school? So these are all healthy discussions that we are having. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you, Fortuna.
So there are more message.
Okay, can we just skip ahead to the next slide, Paula? There's nothing, it's just discussion.
Okay.
Great, because we're having this discussion. Go ahead, Paula, please, with the next comments or questions. Thank you.
Sure. This is a comment. I believe school safety officers should be carrying dual roles as caretakers. The school safety is left at risk. And then is there specific reference provision for how parents who neglect their responsibilities and as outlined in the Act should be dealt with?
There are some provisions in the Act, for example, if a parent fails to support their child's attendance at school, there are some provisions spelled out in the Act in the event that a parent doesn't support their child's attendance at school. But with regard to the other responsibilities, there are no specific consequences spelled out. I would point out that this is a step ahead in terms of spelling out duties and rights of parents and students in more detail. So it's a discussion point. But no, the only provision I can think of is the one around student attendance. If the parent fails to support it, then there are consequences for that, but not for other aspects.
Has any provision been made for schools with dormitories?
There hasn't been explicit reference to schools with dormitories. As I mentioned, we've addressed denominational, private, assisted, public, all different kinds of schools, but not specific reference to those with dormitories, no.
Just scroll. Ooh. Wait. Just finding more of the comments here.
There is one that reads,
how can the Act make provisions for parent-teacher association and not address security? The government has repeatedly stated how important education is for the future of the country. Securing is very important. Do you have a comment on that?
Yes, the Act does speak explicitly to the safety and security of students and staff, and it spells out the importance of it and protecting it. And the National Code of Conduct, one of the goals of the National Code is the protection of the safety and security of students and staff. So it is explicitly addressed and emphasized. And as mentioned some time ago, the authority to protect the safety and security of the schools is spelled out in the Act as well. So it is a huge issue. It is a growing concern that many people share, and it is addressed in the Act and in the National Code of Conduct.
And for clarification, what is the defining difference between teacher and educator? Under the rights and responsibilities of educators, the Act refers to rights of educator, but duties of teacher.
Great question. So an educator is any professional, any education professional appointed to a formal role in a school. So that could be a principal, a vice principal, a teacher, a school counselor. They are all different kinds of educators. So are early childhood educators who do the preschool and early childhood education programs and pre-kindergarten programs. Educator is a broad term. A teacher, a principal, a vice principal, they all fall under it. So it's kind of an umbrella term.
And it just says they should, this person says they should take a kid back if they want to come back and don't discriminate. We would agree. What about the issue of exporting bad behavior of both students and teachers to new schools? I guess that would relate to transferring students and teachers between schools.
Generally speaking, in my experience, with regard, for example, to a student who's suspended, it's the case that a student who is suspended from one school should not be just show up at another school. The suspension was issued for a reason. So that question has been raised with regard to suspension. And it's something we're going to have to look into in more detail. Also with regard to the ministry rules and school rules around suspension. So that issue has been raised, and that's another point that we are looking at to get more detail and a better picture of what's happening right now. I don't know, Sophia, if you wanted to speak to that, but that is an issue that has come to our attention that we need more information on.
Monica, it sounds like the question targeted permanent transfer from one school to the next. There is a situation sometimes if a child has displayed problematic behavior over an extended period of time in one school, then that child is permanently transferred to another school. And sometimes it also happens with teachers who get transferred from one school to another. I am assuming that this is what the person was speaking about and asking whether such is addressed in the Act.
Thank you for the clarification. No, that is not addressed in the Act. So thank you for clarifying that, and to the person who raised the point. These are all really helpful pointers that we need to follow up on.
And then there's a question, doesn't the doesn't the CARE program come at a cost to the parents?
Not. Oh, go ahead.
Well, that's alternative education, and I don't. I think the Act refers to alternative education. The Act doesn't refer to specific programs like CARE.
No, it doesn't. It's that broad umbrella term of alternative education.
Is there financial provision for those students who would do better with alternative education?
That is not spelled out in the Act about any financial provisions. So that's not a point that's been addressed in the Act, no.
And where other legislation covers areas that should be of concern, it should be mentioned in the Education Act, if not entirely at reference to the Act in the question and sections. I think that's referring to where, for example, other legislation, because the Education Act obviously speaks to education, and if there is other legislation, for example, human rights or something else that is covered, it should be cross-referenced, I think is what this person is saying, to the Education Act. It should be mentioned that it's covered in another act or another legislation.
That is a good point. There are some references in the Act, for example, to the cross-reference to the Liquor Control Act or the Constitution with regard to appointment of senior ministry leaders. There are some cross-references, but I appreciate the point about there may be additional areas that need to be flagged. Sophia?
I'm wondering if the Act speaks to, I know this may be a curriculum issue, but I know over the years we've had many questions as it relates to comprehensive sexuality education. Whilst we have signed on to some international agreements which speaks to that, we do not deliver comprehensive sexuality education in St. Lucia. And one of the explanations that have been used in the past is that age of consent is 16, and the Education Act or age of compulsory school education was 15. And so therefore there would have been certain topics that we would not address because children have not yet reached the age of sexual consent. Given the fact that now the Act addresses students up until age 17, it means therefore that we are also addressing children who have reached the age of consent. And so I'm not sure if there's anything in the Act that speaks to that, or is it something that would have to sit or reside within a curriculum policy? Because this is not just an issue for us on the national level, but also we are required to report internationally on such issues.
Thank you for the question. So I've just turned to the regulations, the section on the national curriculum and the regulations. And at the secondary level, it includes provision for family studies, personal development, and relationships. So those are two categories that it might fall under. And also, so that's in forms 1 to 3. In forms 4 and 5, again, there's a provision for family studies, personal development, and relationships. So it may fall under those headings, Sophia. It's not explicitly stated, but those are the headings that might accommodate it.
Thanks. It does not explicitly state it, and so that might still be an area, a contentious area. Thank you. Thank you, Monica.
You're welcome, Sophia. Okay.
Question, is there anything in the Act mandating vaccination for entry?
There is a stipulation in the Act for admission to school requiring proof of vaccination. And that is in the section on student admission to school. So it is an issue that is referenced in the Act. There's also reference made in the Act to contagious diseases. And the conditions under which, for example, a child who has a contagious disease cannot attend school while still infected with that disease. So immunization and contagious diseases are both referenced in the Education Act.
It is my opinion that in today's society, every school needs its own counselors. Does the Education Act speak towards any such things regarding school counselors?
Well, we have added school counselors to the Act. They are very important in terms of service provision, especially for educational psychosocial supports. And with regard to giving, for example, a ratio of how many counselors per students, that is not typically put in an act. That's another staffing or hiring issue for the Ministry of Education as to how they determine how many counselors are allocated to the different schools.
I think this consultation is very beneficial to all stakeholders, and I benefited tremendously, but I believe there are a few important points left out and discussion should continue. I can assure you discussion's continuing for the next 2 weeks. So please, anyone who wants to continue the discussion, they're most welcome to do so. Persons who impact students at schools are very broad. Does the Education Act have anything about the roles and responsibilities of the cooks, janitors, and caretakers who are directly in contact with the students?
No, it doesn't address the duties of support staff in schools. There is some reference made, for example, with regard to school bus drivers, that students have to follow their direction. But other than that, there really isn't specific description of those duties.
But they are also responsible through the Code of Conduct, are they not?
They are members of the school community. Yes, they are.
What about the right of the individual if they don't want their child to have a vaccination?
Well, we're looking at when exemptions might be referenced. So we're looking right now, that's a topic that we're looking into, for example, on religious grounds, or if there were extenuating circumstances. For example, if a doctor determined that a child couldn't have a vaccination because of health concerns, then that would be looked at. So we're looking at adding language to the Act around the grounds for exemptions.
And the last comment in the chat was great questions, participants. So that's the conclusion of anything that's in the chat.
Great. So we're over time, and I apologize, but it's a wonderful conversation. We're happy to stay late. If we could go to the next slide, please, Paula. So we really want to end the night on a very positive note, and we want to hear from you. If you want to put it in the chat or go to the mic, what are your top priorities that need to be addressed in the Draft Act and regulations? Now that you've seen the overview, what do you think is most important for us to focus on? That's the first question. And the second one is, what do you hope will come out of the Draft Act and the regulations? What changes do you hope to see as a result of the Draft Act and regulations? So we'd really like to hear from you in the chat or on the mic. If anyone is brave enough to go to the mic, we'd really like to hear what you think the top priorities are that need to be addressed in the Act and regulations.
So we have another question, Monica. Is there anything in the Act that enforces students after school for not roaming streets in school uniform?
No, there is a provision in the National Code of Conduct that students have to follow the Code of Conduct while on school premises and at school-sponsored events. But with regard to after hours or on the weekends, during those times, the principal and teachers don't have control over students. So it's not part of the Act or the regulations. But
Monica, I just want to say, with reference to this question, whilst they don't have jurisdiction over the children after school, generally, if the children are in school uniform out of the compound, there is still regulations that we tend to have. It's an official policy. So perhaps that's what they're speaking to, because once the children are in uniform, they're still identified as being part of the school, even though they're off the compound. And so perhaps in the Code of Conduct, there should be some statement to that.
And that's an issue that's come up that we've had a lot of discussion about, Sophia. And the
That's
question there is how would it be enforced? Would principals be responsible if students misbehaved at a store or at a dance on a Saturday night? And what would that mean? So it's an issue that we've heard about and we need to dig into more as well.
Thanks, Paula, for that feedback.
Okay, just in terms of what people would like to see, school safety and security, bullying, parent-teacher community is one. And there's a question here. But the issue of discipline and security is a priority for me. And there is a question. Does the Act speak to the increasing the number of school attendance officers? Currently, there is one position for the entire island.
It doesn't speak to a set number, but the role of school attendance counselor has been altered to be school attendance officer. And the way that it's written, the description of the school attendance officer's duties, it could certainly apply to more than one attendance officer. So we've used plurals so that there can be more than one, but there's no recommendation of a number of them because, again, that's a staffing decision for the ministry.
And in answer to question 2 on the slide, the person suggests that the Education Act move beyond draft in due time. In terms of priority sensitivity by teachers to special needs students, basic teacher training on recognizing and handling special needs, employment of special needs teachers and education specialists, education for children on the topic of special needs and how to be sensitive to it and letting them know that not all kids are the same and it's okay to be different. Another person said responsibilities of students in order to gain access, student rights, duties of all staff in shaping the curriculum, a description of the ideal school graduate. And someone else indicated discipline of students.
So some recurring topics there.
Yeah. And again, another one, school safety and security, all forms, teacher-parent support, and discipline of students. So this is really speaking to the National Code of Conduct and emphasizing the importance of school safety and security. And that question, does the Act speak to the protection of teachers from violent students?
Well, the National Code of Conduct certainly speaks to unacceptable behavior, including assault. And so that is explicitly prohibited. So for teachers who might be subjected to that, that is prohibited and there are consequences. So we really are trying to, in the National Code of Conduct, promote positive behavior and behavior supports, but we also recognize there is misbehavior that has to be responded to with significant consequences, and they are spelled out in the code.
And that's the last, I think, of the comments.
Okay, so can we go to our closing slides? We apologize for being over time, but it's an excellent conversation that we really appreciated. And you've highlighted some key topics that we're digging into more. So what are the next steps? What happens after this? Well, the questions and comments provided by you at this town hall meeting and the other meetings that we're going to chair are being recorded and analyzed to identify the main topics and issues that you have raised. So what is of greatest concern to you, the members of the public? These topics and issues will be addressed in the validation and finalization of the Draft Education Act and regulations. And then we will submit a final draft and accompanying report that will be prepared and submitted. So the town hall meetings are happening this week and next week, and we will be working on addressing all these issues that have been raised and preparing a final draft and report to go to the Ministry of Education for consideration.
And Monica, there's a comment here, and this is indicative of some of the challenges that we faced. It is stated that once students are in transit to and from school and are in school uniform, it's the responsibility of the school. I believe that this needs to be changed. It should be the responsibility of the parents when they are in transit to and from the school. So we have varying opinions on that.
We have heard very different opinions on who's responsible for student behavior at different points during the day and on the weekends. We certainly have.
The Act must speak to the new pathways in education and all the facets that accommodate these paradigm shifts. And I think we've certainly discussed that this evening. And I'm just going, a desired inclusion for the Act parent support structures. And I think that's it.
Okay. Next slide, please, Paula.
Sure.
So we're going to turn it back to Mrs. Joseph to provide some closing remarks, and we're going to end with one more slide with a thank you. I want to pause here and thank everyone so sincerely for your participation tonight and for all the issues that you've raised. It's been very, very helpful, and we really appreciate you taking the time. On behalf of Paula and Fortuna and myself, thank you so very much. And we'll turn it over to Mrs. Joseph for some closing comments.
Thank you, Monica. I don't want to be long because we have way past our time. Participants, you have seen that the Revised Education Act is actually to bring our Education Act to the needs of contemporary education. So, and I was really impressed with the discussion, the questions, the comments. So I want to first thank the facilitators, Mrs. Paula McKinnon, Mrs. Fortuna Anthony, and Ms. Dr. Monica Williams for facilitating this consultation, as well as the smooth presentation of the Revised Education Act. You were able to address the questions very well and provide much clarity to the questions asked of you. To the participants, I want to thank you for your presence. Thank you for the interaction. Thank you for the questions. And I think if we have some more time, we will get more questions. I don't know if it is possible that after you have gotten access to the Education Act, that there is some place that you can put in more comments or more questions to the panel. So again, I want to thank you very much for the discussion. Thank you for your participation, and do have a blessed evening. So again, thank you, everyone. That's it.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night to you.
Good night.
Miss Emmanuel, Edith Emmanuel, good night. Thank you.
Good night, Miss. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, good night.
Together we can move mountains.
Good night.
Good night. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
And claims are now paid conveniently through your local financial institution to provide your bank or credit